In the first showdown between Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, we saw a surprising challenger in Alex managing to win against Max in a pretty convincing fashion. Now it was close, but he did manage to win and show pretty good performance through some solid game planning and some technical consistency. Now the second time around when we saw the rematch, that wasn't quite the same story at all. In fact, the fight had a lot of surprises, and I'm actually glad that the rematch didn't turn out the same as the first one, and I'll tell you why later on. Now, the biggest controversy has to be the fact that many people believe that Max won, and there's a lot of conversations going on regarding that, but regardless of the outcome and what happened, my goal here is actually going to be to talk about the things that people may not be having conversations about. And that's going to be about the technical side of what went down. Now, Max didn't look the same at all this second time around in the rematch, and I think it's really important to explore why that was, because to me, that's actually the most compelling part of this story. More or less, when we typically see rematches, they disproportionately tend to end in the same fashion, with the victors winning again. But the moment you see battles where the tide changes in favor of the former loser, it says a lot about the fighter's ability to adapt and their maturity. I'm going to bring you through this journey of the rematch so that you can better understand those changes when we look at the story of the fight between Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, the rematch. In my previous breakdown, I revealed some of the exploits that Volkanovski's team discovered, and I shared some of the interviews going in depth about how they actually took advantage of what Max does. I really suggest checking out that breakdown if you haven't seen it yet, because it shares a lot of detailed analysis on how they actually managed to exploit Max for that fight. But for the sake of time, I'll try to briefly summarize some of those points in this video. Talked about how Alex's corner knew that Max would often put his weight on his front foot. Now this is a normal stance he's used throughout all his fights, and it has a few technical benefits that I talked about in the breakdown, but without going to those details, they actually managed to exploit this stance by using a lot of leg kicks. Now this worked really well because when you have too much of your weight on one side of your body like Max does in this photo, it's really hard to check kicks because of your uneven weight distribution. What we saw was that a lot of kicks went unchecked, and because of Max's stance, it was just really hard to do much about those kicks. But coming into the rematch, Max actually corrected this exploit by using a more upright stance that you can see on the right hand side of this photo. And with this stance, Max's weight is more evenly distributed in between both of his feet, so it gave him a lot more options to deal with the kicks better. So in general, he was able to check kicks and just be able to move around and have better options to deal with those kicks. In their first fight, there was a very specific reason why they wanted to use kicks so often when Max used his orthodox stance. They noticed that Max is pretty great in his orthodox stance, but they also noticed that his defense is pretty lackluster when he fights in southpaw. So in the earlier rounds of the first fight, they used a lot of kicks to discourage Max from using his orthodox stance. And it ended up working because what we ended up seeing was that he began fighting in his southpaw stance, and that's exactly what they wanted because they wanted to exploit his defenses in his southpaw stance. A lot of Alex's signature moves were landing pretty consistently, especially when Max was using his southpaw stance. One particular tactic that worked really well is his next move that I'm going to show you, where Volkanovski is actually going to slip off his center line while stepping over to get closer, and then after he's in range, he pops up with a lead hook. This also seemed to be one of his signature tactics that landed pretty frequently at a very high success rate whenever Max fought in southpaw.
I think Volkanovski will catch him.
He told us on Thursday.
One of the adjustments I wanted to see coming into the rematch for Max was to take away that southpaw stance and use his orthodox stance even more. And my reasoning for that was that they were looking to exploit Max's defensive openings in his southpaw stance. So from Max's perspective, it would have made more sense to deny his opposition the opportunity. And that's exactly what we saw in the rematch. Max completely abandoned his southpaw stance and he went orthodox the whole time. And as a result, we didn't see Max take as much shots as he did compared to the first fight. So these are fight stats for the rematch. It's a little bit hard to see, but I did tally them up for you. Now, Max took about 173 strikes and dealt about 103 strikes in the first fight. And then in the rematch, he took about around 148 strikes and then ended up dealing 161 strikes of his own. You got to keep in mind too that you have to take the stats with a little bit of a grain of salt because they're not really accurate, but they do provide somewhat of a general idea that Max took less hits this time around. And to be more specific, the signature tactics that I did show you earlier wasn't something that landed as much for this rematch. Now this next adjustment Max made, it was kind of a funny one because it was actually a recommendation pointed out by Eugene Behrman, who's one of the coaches at Volkanovski's gym at City Kickboxing. He mentions how the straight knee to the midsection was a pretty effective tool against Alex going to the fight. It only happened once, but it showed to be really useful. Now let's go back to the signature move that I showed you earlier. When Alex does this, he moves his head off the center line, so it makes it really hard to attack the head, but as he moves forward, his body is still relatively static, and that leaves an opportunity for you to fire a straight knee to intercept his forward movement. There were even instances where it looks like Alex was about to use a step over by changing his level, but it looks like Max was able to stop some of that forward movement before he even could get started. Alex showed he was more consistent in the first fight, but the rematch looked a little bit more different. It looked more like the consistency was evenly split this time, so it was kind of like a tug of war of who could get the upper hand in these sequences, and I'll give you an example that showcases this. In this strategy, Alex is actually going to parry Max's lead hand with his own rear hand, and once he sees control of that weapon, Alex tends to shoot that lead hand right down the middle. Now, the purpose of this is to control the opponent's weapon. If you can do that from the very outside of the punching range, you can control one of the opponent's weapon and it eliminates that arm as a temporary threat, so you can actually advance forward with a better chance of avoiding damage. Alex found a lot of consistency landing this in the first fight, and again, the rematch also told a different story. So even though there were times where Alex could land this strategy, we would see some really good adaptation from Max of dealing with this. When Alex would parry Max's lead hand and advance forward, you would see Max slip the attack and then return with his own counter uppercut followed by a lead hook. So watch as Alex attempts to parry with his rear hand, but he kind of misses the parry, but he still comes forward with that lead hand. But notice that he's going to slip off. But Max kind of anticipates this and he throws that rear uppercut, and whether this lands or not, it actually deters Alex to lift his head back up, and that sets him up to get hit with a lead hook from Max's lead hook right there. Then you see he's going to land a lead hook very shortly here. There were moments in the first fight where Max would try this, but he couldn't quite find his rhythm, but in the rematch he was able to find this much more consistently.
Guy with the legs for sure. Nice. He's trying. But it's time to go to work. Give it everything you got. Leave it all out there. Because... Oh, man, he's down again. The end of the round. Wait for it. Boom. Little uppercut. Volkanovski hits the deck.
In this fight, Max would often use a hopping feint against Alex, and the hop is mainly used to emulate an incoming kick like an oblique kick, and it can be stopped midway to use other forms of attacks. But Alex found a lot of success countering this when Max used it in their first fight. But in the rematch, we saw some instances of this happening again, but they happen far less frequently. Max did a better job this time, using other forms of kicking feints to throw off Alex's rhythm. We saw him using a lot of switch feints, and this is a movement that emulates a switch kick. A switch kick is when you lift the lead leg up and then chamber the kick back, that way you can kick from the other side. Max would find some forms of success using a switch foot to feint into kicks, and he would also throw other switch feints too. For example, he would switch his rhythm and pretend he's gauging in the kicking range, and then he would go into using a cross instead of. As a general observation, Max did a relatively good job using kicks in this fight. He spent a lot more time retaliating when getting kicked in the legs as well. Alex was moving a lot towards his right side, so using a spinning back kick was working a lot to punish his movement in that direction. Let's also not forget about the head kick that Max managed to win the round with in the first round. He was doing a really good job of chaining combos and kicks and mixing in various rhythms. So in this sequence, you're going to see that he's going to throw out that rear hand. He's going to pump it forward, and it almost looks like a cross. So Alex is going to go for that bait, so he's going to try to slip off slightly and try to parry it with that rear hand. But you notice that instead of throwing that rear hand, a kick actually comes right over the top and he drops him. Alex found his own moments of success too. He landed a lot of inside leg kick variations, like his inside leg kick to a lead hook. Then there's also his jab step up into an inside leg kick. This is where he usually throws a jab to distract the opponent, and then he uses that to step up in order to set up that inside leg kick.
Of course, whoa, that was a good one. That was a nice left hook.
There's some other things too that Alex found a little bit of success with too. So take a look at this next strategy. So here he's actually going to throw his rear hand and shift up. So his rear foot steps forward, and then he slips to evade Max's jab while throwing a hook clinch. And that allows him to get that single collar clinch. From here he could just throw that rear hand shot. Then here he ends up catching, just barely grazing Max in the back of the head.
He landed. Oh, look at that.
So as UFC commentator Michael Bisping noticed, Max kept his posture more upright and his feet closer together this time. And we explored the reasons why that was. His usual stance tends to be a lot wider and offers more mobility, but for this fight, you had him using more of a narrowed stance, which means that his ability to move much more rapidly was reduced. And because of this, you would see him more likely to stand and trade instead of moving away like in the first fight. So, and an interesting observation to keep in mind is that Alex did find some success in these sequences when they happened to occur when Alex started off in his southpaw position. Now what that actually does is that it creates a mirrored stance where your lead foot meets the opponent's lead foot, and that was similar to what we saw in the first fight when Alex was finding a lot of success. Now Alex was actually able to land some pretty good offense when they were in the mirrored stance. So maybe in the future rematch or future rematch, Alex might be able to utilize a southpaw stance more to see if he can actually capitalize on any kind of possible defensive openings that might be there if Max was to fight him while Alex was using a southpaw to create that mirrored stance. So one of Alexander's signature counters in the first fight was to dip low and come back with that high lead hook. And he actually did find success using this in the rematch too. For this particular counter, you would often see him dip low, and sometimes you would actually see him catch the opponent's hand, like right here. He pulls it down and then comes back with his own lead hook. And that's how you would sometimes see him land this counter. Max showed a really strong ability to stuff takedowns throughout the fight, and for the moments where Alex actually managed to secure a takedown, he couldn't quite keep the position for very long because Max would eventually transition back to his feet using the cage. Of course, there were several different exchanges and random tactics landing here and there, but I just wanted to share some of the more consistent things that I found throughout this fight. But you get a general idea at this point that this was a back and forth battle of knuckle warfare. I can't really tell you who won this fight based on the core tenets of the scoring criteria, but from an analyst perspective, I can offer you this. The fight was a lot closer this time from a technical perspective, and although we saw some glimpse of success from one fighter, we'd also see similar moments of success from the other fighter as well. The consistency was back and forth. unlike the first showdown. And this actually brings me back to my original statement in the video, and why I said that I was glad that this fight didn't turn out like the first one. When these fighters step into the cage, they create a story that goes down in the history books for us to go back and talk about. And what we saw in the rematch wasn't the same rehashed story of the first fight. It was something new that told us more about the fighter's ability to adapt. Max didn't plan on coming in as the same fighter as he did last time, and I think that's the most surprising part. He actually invested time in changing very specific things that got him in trouble in the first fight. And it's a pretty amazing part that he was able to do this with a very short amount of time and very limited resources, considering that he did his training supposedly with no sparring and not a lot of coaching. Most of his coaching was done through Zoom, which is a video chat service. Now, his changes were so dramatic that he looked so different from his usual style, and that's a very hard feat to accomplish on his own. And Max did it too, and it's pretty impressive. Alex did some pretty good things in this fight, and it was pretty interesting to see how he would adapt to the way Max would change coming into the rematch. And for me, these are the stories I look forward to seeing the most, because when I watch these kind of rematches, it has a different kind of outcome. Stylistically, there's a lot to learn and take away from these kinds of experiences. Hey everybody, I just want to say thanks for everyone who subscribed, and I really appreciate all the subs and shares that I get from all of you. If you like my work and you want to see more analysis from my channel, I also have other analysis work on my WordPress too, so come check it out. I'll leave links in descriptions along with some other resources. Just landed in Vegas for another quarantine and was told some guys in the media are receiving threats for saying my fight was not a robbery. This is not okay. I appreciate everyone who wants a ride for me, but that ain't it.
Nothing wrong with being a virgin and a nerd.